Welcome to Parsha Vayigash. And my plan and hope for us is that we're going to explore three different women who make an appearance in the next two Parshiot, two in this week's Parsha, one next week, and think about some of their midrashic backstory. This week's Parsha starts very dramatically when Yosef reveals himself and the brothers have a reunion and they go to get Yaakov, their father, and they tell him that Yosef is alive. And then when they go down to Egypt, we take a small break for a census. And censuses are usually boring on the surface of things, I think in like modern secular censuses also. But they often hold a deep wealth of really interesting, juicy information. And in the Torah, they're a place where the midrashic backstory really runs wild. They uncover all sorts of personalities. And so I want to look at two of the women who pop up in this week's census. So I'm going to share my screen here. And we'll look at this, wrong spot. Okay, there we go. So in the middle, the census is very organized. It works by each of Yaakov's wives in order. And so the text has just laid out all of the children and grandchildren born to Leah and Yaakov in Padam Aram. It even mentions Dinah. And then it says, Kol nefesh banav uvenotav shloshim v'shalosh. It seems on the surface to be quite plain. However, if you count carefully, if you were to go back, you would see that in fact there are 32 names listed. And so this is, of course, going to drive lots of people very crazy, because why does it say 33? Now, interestingly, when I cut and paste this from Sefaria, there's a little asterisk that I declined to bring with me that says that the 33rd person is Yaakov himself. And we'll see that in the Midrash. I think it's super interesting that is the option Sefaria went with, because I think it's probably the least, it fits into the pshat the least well, the least pshat-like in some ways, because it says all of his grandsons and granddaughters, 33 souls. So to include Yaakov is kind of a bold move. But that's how Sefaria chooses to help us out. Rashi is not interested in that translation. Rashi explains the problem first, right? Right? Who is the 33rd? There are only 32. The name who is omitted is Yocheved, who is born between the walls, just as they entered the border city. So this is a fascinating idea. Rashi is saying that the person who is not counted is someone who was conceived in Padan Aram, or in Canaan, but is not yet born until they get into Egypt. It's sort of an interesting idea. It's an interesting idea that Rashi thinks there's only one of them, right? There must have been many, many women who were pregnant on this journey. But yet this is the one that Rashi is counting. And who is it? But it is Yocheved. And Shneimar Asher Yalda Oto LeLevi b'Mitzrayim. Right, that it says later in the next sentence, Yocheved, the daughter of Levi, whom her mother bore to Levi in Egypt. She was born in Egypt, but she was not conceived in Egypt. So this is an interesting story if you don't even consider who Yocheved is. But if you think of Yocheved as the mother of Moshe, which is who she is, right? We say that Moshe is born in the tribe of Levi. This makes Yocheved very, very old at the time of Moshe's birth, right? Because she's born right when they get there. They have many good years. We see that Bnei Israel are in Egypt for 400 or 200 or 300, right? Sort of depending on your math years. The Ramban is very unhappy with this explanation. He says she'd be 130. No one has babies then. And if they do, the Torah tells you, like it's a miracle, right? Like with Sarah, when she has a baby in old age, it couldn't possibly be. But Rashi is quite taken with this idea. He mentions this midrash in 4 separate places related to Yocheved. And it seems like he is certain of it. And I think that there maybe are 2 reasons that Rashi is so interested in Yocheved being on this trip. And one is that she is a bridge, possibly, between like the Bereshit part of our history and the Shemot chapter of our history. It says in the beginning of Shemot, which is only 3 parshiot away, even though it's many hundreds of years, V'tahar ha'isha v'teled ben, right, that Yocheved conceived and bore a son, v'terei oto ki tofu, right? And we actually, for those who are at brunch on Monday, which was so much fun, we talked about this midrash about in terms of light, that Yocheved, it says that she saw him and he was good. And the Gemara in Sota picks up on how that has just a very nice ring to it, sort of like Vayar Elokim ki tov in Breshit, that God created light and saw that it was good. In Breshit. And so Yocheved is perhaps in some kind of, is acting in the divine image by having Moshe. And in fact, in Sota, it tells us that Moshe's house was filled with light when Moshe was born because ki tovu, and they link it to Breshit. But perhaps Rashi wants there to be a stronger connection between the Moshe chapter, like the nation building part of our story, with the nuclear family part of our story. And so when Moshe is just born into Shevet Levi, that's like a weaker transition. But if Moshe is Levi's grandson, which is like a kind of wild thing to think, then he's the great grandson of Yaakov, that's a much stronger connection there. And so, I think it's an interesting idea to think that, having just had children myself, right? Like we say, children can hear what's going on in the womb. And sometimes the smells or other senses also sort of kick in earlier. And so it's interesting to think that Yocheved, who has Moshe, maybe like heard or smelled the way things used to be when it was Breshit, when it was Yaakov's sort of domain. And that's why Rashi maybe is so interested in including her in the list. But as I mentioned, Bereshit Rabbah has a few other ideas. It's sort of a hard text to bring here because there are a lot of psukim, like they're sort of interested in proving it. I'm not so sure we're interested in that. But some say, Vayigash omrim Yaakov hishlim imahem et haminyan. That's the route Sefaria chooses to go. Some say HaKadosh Baruch Hu hishlim imahem et haminyan. This is one that I had heard as a child, right? It was that Hashem was the 70th soul or the 33rd soul in Leah's genealogy. Because it says in the Torah, when God is talking to Abraham, that God will come down to Egypt with us. I think that's a beautiful idea on some level. It's sort of not the direction of this class and this conversation, but it's a nice one. And then the Midrash mentions 2 other people. One of them we've talked about here and in his wild story. That's Bnei Dan, Uvnei Dan Chushim. So Chushim, the son of Dan, has his own whole midrashic chapter. For those of you who were here when we talked about the Ma'arat HaMachpelah and how there are 4 couples buried there, and then possibly Esav's head. I don't know if anyone remembers this story, but there's a idea that Esav and Yaakov, when Yaakov dies, Esav runs to the Ma'arah to try to stop his sons from burying him there, because Esav wants that slot, right? Just like he wanted the Bechor in the end. He feels like the Ma'arah belongs to him, that, right, there was one spot for a son. Why should Yaakov at it? Esav runs there, and when the brothers get there with the body of Yaakov, they have to run back to Egypt to get the deed to the land, whatever that means. And so they're waiting. Yaakov's body is there, Esav is standing there, and Chushim, the son of Dan, gets fed up. And he says, this is ridiculous. We're not going to leave our grandfather lying in wait. And he either clubs Esav on the head, or maybe he beheads him, and the head of Esav rolls down the hill and into the Ma'arah. It's kind of a crazy story, and it's interesting that that's the one that they pull up here. This is the one who is somehow not mentioned. Now, why is he not mentioned? It's because it says Uvnei Dan, and then it lists this one guy who has a name that sounds like a plural name, right? It's not Uben Dan Chlush, but Bnei Dan Chlushim. And so the Bereshit Rabbah says, oh, maybe they were like twins or something. They came as some sort of package. So that's 32 and 33, right? That's interesting. But the last one is the one I want to focus on here. So they mention another woman. This is Serach bat Asher. She's one of my favorite characters in the genealogy lists. And she has a super interesting background as well. She's mentioned in the pasuk about Asher's sons, right? He has Yimna, Yishva, Yishvi, Uvriah. Always interesting to note like which names stick around. Like we have tons of Levis and Ashers. We don't have a lot of Yimnas or Yishvas. Serach achotam. And here the Midrash says, why does it say Serach achotam, the sister of Asher's sons, not Asher's daughter? And there's an idea that maybe Serach comes from somewhere else. She is already born when Asher marries her mother. And then Serach's mother gives Asher several sons. And so this is their half-sister, right? Same mother, different father, which I think is an interesting backstory because Serach is given some sort of like magical powers or sort of super special characteristics. And so interesting that the Midrash that does that also wants to maybe distance her from the line of Yaakov. But here we see, this is the best sort of recap of the story that I could find, but it shows up in many, many places, that this is, right, we're backing up a tiny bit before the census. The brothers have come back from Egypt to tell Yaakov that Yosef is alive, but they're worried. Even good news that's so shocking could be a major strain, especially to someone who's very old. And so they say, what shall we do in this matter before our father, right? If we come suddenly to him and tell him the matter, he will be greatly alarmed at our words and will not believe us. And so their solution is they found Serach, daughter of Asher, going forth to meet them. And she was very good and subtle. I love that definition. I strive to be a Serach bat Asher sometimes, very good and subtle. And she knew how to play upon the harp, not a skill of mine. And they took her and gave her a harp and they said, oh, yes, Anna?
Oh, no.
Oh,
I didn't say anything.
Your box went green. They took her and gave her a harp and said, go now before our father, sit before him and strike upon the harp and speak these words, right? So they have this plan for how Serach is sort of going to gently ease Yaakov into the knowledge that Yosef is still alive. And she played well and she sang and she uttered in the sweetness of her words, Yosef, my uncle, is living and he rules throughout the land of Egypt and is not dead. And she continued to repeat and utter these words. I sort of like imagine her saying it very softly at first and then maybe like a little bit louder. And Yaakov heard these words and they were agreeable. And he listened while she repeated them twice and thrice. And joy entered the heart of Yaakov at the sweetness of her words. And the spirit of God was upon him. And he knew all her words to be true. So I think this is a beautiful story. It's a nice backstory that the brothers at last showed a little bit more sensitivity to their father and his like emotional and his mental state, and that they found this beautiful way to have his granddaughter help break the news. It highlights this lovely young lady's skill set. I think it's just a nice midrash all around. And this is where it sort of like goes into midrash land, a sharp left turn. And then Yaakov blessed Serach when she spoke these words before him. And he said to her, my daughter, may death never prevail over you, for you have revived my spirit. So somehow, Serach, whether it's because of this story or because of something else, and this story is sort of working it backwards into the story, Serach is known as someone who has never died. In the tractate Derech Eretz Zuta, but also in many midrashim, there are lists of people who go to Gan Eden alive, right? I think Eliyahu is probably the most well-known, right? It says that he went up in a chariot of fire, and so, right, we say that he never died. And here there's this long list, and I wanted to look them all up today, and I never did, but I am interested in how these people make this list of 9. Maybe you guys know some of them. Mm-hmm. But Chanoch ben Yared, the Chanuch, the son of Jared, Eliyahu, Mashiach, which is like an interesting one because that's not like a person that we know. It's like an unknown person. Eliezer, Eved, Avraham, that was an interesting one. I'm not sure what he did. Maybe finding Rivka that sort of merited him that great bracha of not having to die. I was asking Will if he knew who these guys were. Hiram Melech Sur Eved Melech Hakushi. I'm not sure, again, what they did to be on this list. Yavet's the grandson of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. I did look up this pasuk in Divrei Hayamim, but it just mentions who he is, not what he did, but that he was nice, maybe. Batya Bat Paro is another really interesting one that she would merit this list for drawing Moshe out of the water. And Serach Bat Asher, maybe also Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, but she has some kind of immortal status. So I think the question is why, right? Why Serach? Why is she immortal? And here I think we see from the Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer, why? And again, like Yocheved, she plays some kind of bridge role in the life of the Jewish people's sort of evolution from being a Bereshit-centered sort of nuclear family-centered narrative to being a narrative of the Jewish people as a whole. So it says, the Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer says that when Moshe and Aaron come to the Ziknei Yisrael, they made some kind of special sign, right? That Hashem had spoken to them. They were like providing their credentials. And the question that the Midrash has is how do the Ziknei Yisrael know what the sign is? Right? It's been many, many years. Even if there was a tradition, you can sort of imagine, right? Anyone who's read about like the Marano traditions, right? Like people who do sort of funny things, but they don't know exactly why they do them. I think that's sort of what we imagine about Bnei Israel, that they might sort of have this memory of signs that they were supposed to watch out for, but they don't remember them anymore. It's been too long. The tradition has sort of started to fall apart. And they're not sure how to interpret them. And so what do they do, right? What do you do in such a case? They went to Serach Bat Asher and said to her, a man has come before us with these signs. And she said, there is nothing to that man. He said, God will remember you. And she said, he is the man who will bring Israel out of Egypt. For I heard my father, pay, pakod, ifkod, that those are like the magic words, right? Open sesame, whatever it was that Moshe was supposed to say, this is it. And they immediately believed in God and his emissary, as it says, right? That God remembered his people. And so somehow Serach is like the vault for all the secrets, right? She was alive. She remembered Yaakov. She sang to Yaakov, right? She was more than even Yocheved on this list. She really belonged in that generation. And she actually remembers lots of things. I found a great midrash that I want to save for the right time in Shemot about this crazy thing she remembers, right? But she sort of remembers lots of things. She becomes the what's that app like that keeps all your passwords, right? She is that thing in Tanakh. And so I think that the connection between Yocheved and Serach, I had set out to put together a search about Serach when I saw this thing about Yocheved, is that the Midrash is worried about what will happen to our tradition as we move from one model of Jewish community to another, and from one geographic location, a holy geographic location, to a less holy one, as we go from having like a really entrenched familial connection to some sort of assimilation, whether it's names or clothes or whatever language, whatever the things are. And so they needed to find someone on this list who would be the memory keeper, who would hold that tradition, who would bridge that gap. I think it's super interesting that they're both women, right? So like the Mimetic tradition is a very strong tradition in the Midrash also. And so that there's something to that. I'd love to hear what other people have to think or have to say about those ideas. But I really think that that's what's driving the Midrash here, is finding someone who will remind us of all of the things that we left in Canaan and that we left in like the family of Yaakov, especially after Yaakov dies. to help us not just be a nation that gets freed from Egypt, but be the nation who is the ancestor of Yaakov, right? Who bears Yaakov's memory and all of that piece of it. Yeah, so I'll break there for a second before my finale. Any thoughts or reflections? Okay, while it percolates, maybe for people, I want to close with what I think was a beautiful idea. I'll look at everyone's faces, that I read about this Rashi, right? What's bothering Rashi? Why does he bring up this Yocheved Midrash so many times? Rabbi David Kasher in his Parsha blog points out that Rashi is well known for having only daughters and for perhaps teaching his daughters a lot of Torah. And then we know, right, that Rashi's daughters marry well-known and very erudite rabbis, and who go on to be some of our best thinkers, right? The Tosafot, who perpetuate our Torah, but it's not Rashi's daughters, right? It's Rashi's sons-in-law, and one of Rashi's daughters is named Yocheved. And so Rabbi Kasher was wondering which direction Rashi's obsession with this midrash went in. Was he obsessed with the midrash so he named his daughter Yocheved? Or did he name his daughter Yocheved and then find this midrashic vein, and he was especially taken with it because his own daughter was named Yocheved? So I liked the idea of Rashi as a family man. I thought that was sort of an interesting piece to this puzzle. But I think what Rabbi Kasher articulates even more beautifully is the idea that Rashi's daughter Yocheved was a woman who walked between the walls, that she was someone who had to be a Torah scholar, but also just the mother and wife of a Torah scholar. And she was someone who perpetuated Rashi's tradition by helping to further his family without ever putting her name on a sefer or idea herself. And that all of us are Yocheveds in some way or another, not necessarily as the bridge, as the way I was thinking of it at first, but as people who walk between the walls, conceived in one spot, born in another, having to sort of balance the two. And in that way, it's very beautiful that the Torah counts her in the census, right? To say that even when you're sort of as my Bubby would say, nishtahen, right? Not neither here nor there, you still count, right? You still have, that's a hard place to be. And so the census counts you as though you were there, even when you're not really quite yet there. So I think whether we think of her as a bridge gapper or a wall walker, a balancer, Yocheved is a very inspiring character here and a super interesting connection to our story as it continues. And Serach Bat Asher is someone to sort of keep an eye on as we go forward, because she remembers lots of really interesting things for us. And I think thinking about the role of those people in our lives and making sure that they make it onto the census, right? It's interesting because Serach is actually on the census, but the Midrash still wants to include her again in some way as this sort of behind the scenes whisperer. So I hope that we can find interesting characters wherever we go in the census and outside of it throughout the week. And I welcome thoughts and ideas before we say goodbye, if anyone would like to share.
It was a beautiful story, how you weaved Rashi's biography into his theology, so to speak. And I was thinking, there are some people that say that you can't understand philosophers in their philosophies unless you know their biography. Mm-hmm. And I wonder how many of these heroes of our tradition have fallen to the same thing, but their personal touch that led them to the insights that they have. It's a job for you, not for me.
Yeah, I had known that about Rashi, that woman who wrote those books, Rashi's Daughters, right? She made that sort of a very famous thing, but I had never thought about how it would affect him as a darshan, having, especially in those years that they were growing up, having really no heir to his legacy at that time. It's interesting. Or maybe feeling like he did, but a very subversive, set of heirs. And what it would be like to be Rabbeinu Tam, to marry and knowing you're sort of the patsy for your wife. Super interesting.
I read those books. They were good.
Were they? I've never read them.
Yeah.
I'll have to pick them up. Yeah, I don't know a lot about other darshan's backstories. Some of them, who was a doctor, who was a philosopher, or a lawyer, who was well respected, who was not. But Yeah, it's interesting to think about how it guides their, right? We all bring ourselves to our Torah study for sure.
Mhm.
I mean, you hear about that in the Gemara a little bit, right? Like with the stories of, I forget who's who, but you know, the poor guy who get the rich guys who say, oh, you can only do this, and they don't understand everyone else. And I mean, that's
Right.
explicit in stories in the Gemara about rulings that they have. And Rabban Gamliel, the rich guy who gets kicked out and then repents and comes back in, that kind of thing.
Yeah. And now his name is escaping me also, but the one who used to be a bandit, right? Often his
Reish Lakish, yeah.
Reish Lakish, thank you. Right. Often his stories have to do with sort of themes of teshuvah because of that. And you think like, oh, he really got it. He embodied that thing himself. Also, he was known to be very beautiful, and sometimes the commentary sort of like touches upon people who look good or don't look good. Yeah, I think you're right. In the Gemara, it's much more explicit. People wear their professions and their sort of their baggage on their sleeves. Yeah. Cool. Well, it was so nice to see so many of you over the last week. And I look forward to being back in town, not this Shabbat, but the next one. Maybe if there's a thaw, I'll get to see some of you again. I hope you enjoy the warm weather of the next few days. It looks quite balmy in Chicago right now.
Yeah.
It's going to be 50 tomorrow.
Yeah.
Snow is melting.
Yeah. Oh, wow. It's not quite that. It didn't hit quite as cold, and it's not going to hit quite as warm here in Ann Arbor, but next time. All right. I'll see you later. Have a wonderful week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.